Now, you've all heard that Connecticut is in an economic crisis, but Connecticut is in a much bigger crisis than you know. First, there's the economic crisis. Second, there's the leadership crisis. And third, there's the cultural crisis. First, the economic crisis. Falling revenues cannot meet rising spending. Despite 3 massive infusions of new sources of annual revenue for Connecticut over the past 20 years, the state's appetite for our money has only increased. There was the addition of the income tax, then the addition of Indian gaming revenues, then the infusion of the tobacco settlement money. Despite all of this, Connecticut is one of only 2 states among the 50 that has lost population significantly during the same time period. Clearly, spending does not create a good economy. With record job losses, companies leaving the state or closing, the revenue stream will continue to fall precipitously. As more unemployed workers leave the state in search of work elsewhere, Connecticut will continue to lose population, imposing a greater tax burden on those of us who stay. And as we lose businesses and population, the remaining businesses that served the departing businesses and their employees will fail, ever magnifying the widening shortfall between revenues and expenditures. We in Connecticut are on a collision course, and the time for last-minute measures is running out. This 20-year spending binge has to come to an end, and it has to come to an end now. So most of you know by now, we are in a true economic crisis in Connecticut. But then there's Connecticut's leadership crisis. Here in Connecticut, there is little leadership at the top. While the Secretary of State uses our money to compile the list of the most personal features and proclivities of all who deal with her office, the legislative majority renders the governor impotent, forcing her to deal with the crisis alone, all while the Attorney General continues to bully and grandstand and intimidate law-abiding businesses in Connecticut to the point where they too, in many cases, give up, close down, and depart. There is no delicate way to say that the current legislative majority and their so-called leadership is directly to blame for Connecticut's economic predicament. They have been unwilling to take the steps needed to avert a crisis despite years of warning signs and pleas from the governor. Now, I hesitate to call the majority in the legislature addicts, since it's a pejorative term, but I can see no other analogy that fits. Like drug addicts, the legislature's majority are addicted to spending. They are addicted to using our money to hand out political favors to their friends. Like an alcoholic or an addict, they will promise us this year that they get it, finally, and they will ask for us to vote for them again because they promised to come clean. Well, like an addict, they mean this sincerely, they really do. But they can't do it, and they won't do it. We cannot delay another moment. We cannot afford to wait around to see if these politicians might someday change. Without a fundamental change in the legislative majority in this state, the new governor of either party will be unable to bring about the critical changes that are needed immediately in this state. The majority in charge of the legislature must be voted out now. So we have an economic crisis, we have a leadership crisis, and finally, there's Connecticut's cultural crisis. Now, who would have expected to live in a state where a high school that finds the largest auditorium in its area and decides to hold its graduation there would face litigation because that public amphitheater happens to be in a church? Who would have thought that we would live in a state where the placement of yellow ribbons on trees at a town green in honor of our troops at war and our fallen soldiers would be forbidden? Who would have thought that one day we would live in a state when a person with a lesser score on an entrance exam, civil service exam, would get the job, while the person with a higher score would not? And who would have envisioned the day when bad parenting is considered good and good parenting is deemed bad? Who would have thought we would see the day when competition in markets must be stopped by the state and state monopolies sanctioned? Connecticut risks becoming too much like what Alice found down the rabbit hole. A place where nothing makes sense or is what it appears, a place that is utterly nonsensical. Connecticut runs the risk of creating its own permanent irrelevance, losing productive residents who value living in a rational and free society who leave Connecticut to find another state. As Attorney General, I will bring courage, leadership, reason, and common sense back to Connecticut. And I will do all that's in my power to turn this deplorable state of affairs around. Now, I may not succeed, but it will not be for lack of trying, and it will not be for a lack of understanding of what's right. Here's my plan.